My name is Celeste Marlowe, and for the first time in my adult life, I had finally begun to breathe, without the weight of my family's constant demands pressing down on my chest. After years of working double shifts as a surgical nurse, I had quietly built a life that was mine alone. An apartment filled with warm light, a savings account that wasn't gasping for air, and a small but growing side business managing financial workshops for young healthcare workers. It wasn't luxury, but it was freedom. And then, one Saturday morning, that freedom showed up at my door in the shape of my mother and my selfish brother, Damon. I still remember how my mother's perfume entered before she did. Expensive, floral, and suffocating. Damon followed behind her, holding a coffee cup he hadn't paid for, wearing his usual smug grin that said the world owes me everything. Celeste. My mother began with the tone she reserved for guilt, trips dressed as affection. We were just in the neighborhood. I knew that tone. I knew that lie. My stomach tightened. You live 3 cities away, Mom. She ignored that. Damon tossed his keys on my counter like it was his place. You've been avoiding family dinners, he said, stretching across my couch. Mom's worried you're hiding something. I've been working, I said sharply. Like always. Then Mom's smile shifted. Too smooth, too practiced. We know, darling. And we're so proud. But imagine my surprise when your uncle mentioned your name during brunch last week. Apparently, the hospital's financial department listed you as the new coordinator for their training program. Quite the promotion, and quite the raise. Her words hit like ice water down my spine. She knew. Before I could respond, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Printed screenshots of my LinkedIn profile, salary statistics, and a photo from the hospital's announcement post. You should have told us, sweetheart, she said sweetly. Family shares things like this. Damon's grin widened. So, how much are we talking? You must be making, what, 6 figures now? My chest burned. That's not your business. Mom gave a delicate laugh. Oh? Celeste, don't be dramatic. You know how tight things have been for your brother since his business fell apart. He's just trying to get back on his feet. We thought, maybe you could help, just until he's stable again. Damon leaned forward. 10 grand would do it. Maybe 12. You wouldn't even miss it, right? My pulse pounded in my ears. I had worked for years. Nights, holidays, shifts that broke my body. And now, they wanted to take that piece away as easily as exhaling. I can't help. I said, each word slow, careful. Not anymore. My mother's smile vanished. Not anymore. You and Damon drained my savings when Dad got sick. I reminded her quietly. I paid his medical bills. I paid for Damon's car when he crashed it. I paid your mortgage when you said you'd lose the house. Mom's eyes flashed. And we were grateful. Were you? I asked. Because gratitude doesn't look like showing up at my door demanding more. Damon stood up, his voice rising. You owe us, Celeste. You wouldn't have even gotten through nursing school if Mom hadn't covered your tuition that first year. I stared at him, realizing for the first time that they truly believed I was theirs to drain. Mom rose too, her expression hard now. We're your family. That means something. Yes, I said quietly. It means you should have cared about me when I had nothing. They left soon after. Mom fuming, Damon muttering something about ungrateful daughters. But the silence they left behind wasn't peace. It was a warning, because something in my mother's eyes told me this wasn't over. That night, as rain tapped against my window, I opened my banking app and froze. A new withdrawal appeared. 3,200. Unauthorized. Transferred to an account under my mother's name. My chest tightened. I knew exactly what had happened. She'd somehow gotten my information again. And that was the night I decided. If my family saw me as an endless well, it was time they learned what happens when a well runs dry. This time, they wouldn't see me coming. I didn't sleep that night. The 3,200 withdrawal sat on my screen like an accusation. A wound opened where I'd already learned to be careful. I replayed the visit in my head. The way my mother had flipped through the folder, like a dealer revealing a hand. The way Damon had lounged on my sofa, as if he owned the cushions. Both had come to harvest. Both had left with nothing but the memory of my face. Morning came gray and thin, and I put on my scrubs like armor. At the hospital my hands moved on autopilot. IVs, vitals, a woman's gentle sigh as pain subsided under a dose of morphine. Work steadied me. In the bright fluorescent light the world made sense. People blood, healed, and had to tell the truth about their temperature and their pressure. My family's lies felt small against that clinical honesty. But until the final balance was settled, the anger sat behind my ribs like a second pulse. After my shift I made the rounds I'd never had time for before: passwords, privacy settings, bank security protocols. I changed everything: 2-factor authentication, biometric locks. New passwords so long my fingers cramped to type them. I called my bank and demanded a fraud investigation. The representative's calm voice was a small consolation. "We'll freeze the transfers," she said. "We'll flag the account." I added another layer. An alert that would ping me any time a new outbound transfer tried to leave my account. Then I did something a different Julia might not have done. I started to count, not just the recent $3,200, but the litany of family favors might had bled me dry for years. My memory had a ledger: the semester of tuition in senior year that Mom covered and never repaid, the down payment I'd made on Damon's broken truck, the month I wired money to pay a medical bill that should have been his. Each entry threaded into the next, until the total looked like a brick in my hands. Heavy, undeniable. I opened a new spreadsheet and gave it a clinical title: Family Reimbursement Record 2008-2026. Line by line, I entered dates, amounts, text message evidence, Venmo transfers, odd cash pickups. The numbers hunched into place like soldiers. It wasn't about the money alone anymore. It was a map of a lifetime of taking. By nightfall the spreadsheet glowed on my laptop like a confession. The total was more than I expected: a cold, round figure that made my heart kick. I saved the file as a PDF, printed a hard copy, and tucked it into a black folder. I was methodical because emotion was a luxury I could no longer afford. I would be precise. I would be incontrovertible. I also called a friend, Maya Lynn, a paralegal who had once told me that paper could be a scalpel. Maya listened, then said, "You have records. That's everything. Don't threaten. Document. Let the documents speak." She recommended an attorney who specialized in family financial disputes, and I scheduled a consult for the next week. The consultation was short and sharp. The attorney, Celeste Park, leaned forward, eyes soft but businesslike. "You've done the right thing," he said. "Unauthorized transfers, information compromise, repeated financial dependence masked as family help. There's a pattern. We can pursue restitution. Civil, not criminal, unless there's clear evidence of hacking tied to your mother, which you might have. We'll need to preserve everything and prepare for pushback." "Pushback?" I asked, tasting the word. It arrived the next morning. They began with pity. My mother called, voice honeyed. "You're making a scene, Celeste. You're hurting the family." My dad texted, heart emojis, and thin lines of support that felt like placeholders. Damon posted a string of passive, aggressive comments on my sister's feed about being generous and understanding. The family WhatsApp filled with people stepping into positions. Sides forming around silences and assumptions. The day after my consult, someone attempted to reset my email password. A notification popped up, and the second factor pinged to my phone. I denied the request and traced the IP. The log was a small, ugly printout of proof. An attempt logged from a network that traced back near Mom's town. When I showed it to Silas, he didn't smile. "This helps the case," he said, tapping the printout. "It's digital breadcrumbs. You keep them. Don't interact. Let us build the story." I did one more thing, quietly. I reached out to my father. It wasn't to drag him into the court fight, though he deserved the truth. It was to tell him, finally, what I had always been too tired to say, that I was not a charity, and I would no longer be treated like one. His voice broke on the other line. "I always thought she'd change," he admitted. "I'm sorry, honey. I should have done more. If there's anything I can do. Don't apologize to me, I said. Just don't make it easy for them. He promised, with a softness that made my chest ache. For the first time, I felt he was on my side in a way that mattered. He called his sister, a cousin. People who had seen Marie's pattern and had turned away from it. The halt of social support was slow, like rain beginning after a long drought. As the days ticked, I laid in place the tools of patience, a legal timeline, printouts sealed in envelopes, screenshots labeled by date. I made copies and sent some to Maya for safekeeping. I recorded a voicemail from my mother, where she said, "Do what you must." A small threat wrapped in theatrical hurt. I took it to Silas, who asked that I stop responding to provocation. He'd said once, "Emotion is evidence's enemy." I laughed then, bitter and private. A turning point came the week before the restraining legal moves. Damon left his social media, unlocked on my shared family tablet, when he came by for dinner. He'd been careless that night, drunk and boastful. I scrolled and found bank details, the rank arrogance of his life on display. Receipts for site renovations, a bracket for a luxury watch, subscriptions that screamed irresponsibility. It didn't matter if he'd earned any of that, it mattered that he expected me to bankroll it. I took screenshots. The evidence kept building, a mosaic of entitlement. The day we filed the civil notice was anticlimactic in the small, clerical way of bureaucracy. An emailed letter to my mother requesting restitution. A certified letter mailed. Copies saved. I felt both ridiculous and powerful. Like someone who finally learned to say the word "no" out loud in a room that had used that silence to carve them up for years. They responded with anger. My mother's note was a confession of hurt, crafted like theater. "How could you accuse your family?" she wrote. "After all we've done." She sent photos of a framed portrait of me as a child, smiling at a birthday cake. It was manipulative, and I was not surprised. Damon called, breathless, accusing me of ruining everything, and threatening to cut me off socially. My father, still scrambling for repair, tried to negotiate behind his wife's back, pulling at strings I didn't want him pulling. But some of the cracks had already formed. Aunt Lucia, who'd always been discreetly skeptical of my mother's lifestyle, reached out with a text simply saying, "I'm here." A cousin messaged a photograph of an old ledger showing loans my mother had never repaid. The net was tightening. That night, I sat at my window with a cup of coffee gone cold. Rain slicked the glass and Orlando's lights twinkled like small, indifferent witnesses. For years I had been giving pieces of myself away. Time, money, trust. Because I thought family was the only place left that mattered. Now, with paper in hand and legal counsel beside me, I realized that sometimes the place where you belong is the one you build yourself. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it sharpened a resolve I hadn't known lived in me. I slept for 3 hours and woke with my hands steady. The plan was simple and clinical: preserve the evidence. Let the legal mechanisms fold, and prepare for the fallout. But beneath that plan lived another, softer intention. One that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with life. I would not merely be right, I would be whole. I would not merely force restitution. I would rebuild a life that made their demands feel petty and irrelevant. Next, when the enforced letters began to land, and the family's veneer cracked, the house of cards would glow ugly in the daylight. They would call me cruel. They would try to argue about the meaning of family. They would call friends and cousins and pastors to testify about my temperament. I counted on it. It would be the predictable performance of people who had always chosen image over truth. So I waited. I kept records. I worked. I taught a workshop on fiscal responsibility for nurses, and watched the young faces in the room nod as they made budgets for the first time. Their aspirational eyes reminded me why I had worked so hard in the first place. To be the woman who could say yes to herself first. And when the first letter came back, return receipt signed, reading received, M. Marlowe, I felt the first small click of the lock falling into place. This was not yet victory. It was the start of a long war fought by files, truths, and quiet endurance. But the important thing, for the first time, my family saw my refusal reflected in paper. They did not like the reflection. I tried to keep peace. I really did. But when you're constantly pushed, used, and belittled by your own blood, something inside you begins to snap. A week after that ugly dinner, my mother and brother showed up again. This time, they didn't even knock. I heard the key turn in my lock. The spare one my mother had guilted me into giving her. For emergencies. They barged in as if they owned the place. Ethan tossed his muddy shoes on my carpet, plopped onto my couch, and switched on my TV. Mom walked straight to the kitchen, opening my fridge like it was hers. "Where's the rest of the lasagna you made last week?" "I told you to keep it for me," she said. That was it. The calm, patient daughter they'd walked over for years was gone. "Get out," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice from shaking. She blinked, confused. "Excuse me," I said. "Get out of my house. Both of you," Ethan scoffed. "You've really changed, huh? Acting all high and mighty because you got a job and a fancy apartment. Don't forget who raised you." "Raised me?" I snapped. "You mean the woman who drained my savings when I was in college, left me with rent I couldn't pay, and told me it was my duty to take care of my brother? You mean that mother?" Her face flushed. "Watch your tone, Natalie. You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for me." I laughed bitterly. "You mean, I wouldn't have learned to survive despite you?" She stepped closer, her voice sharp. "After everything I've done, you're just going to throw your family away?" I met her gaze. "You threw me away first." That was the last conversation we had for a while. She stormed out, muttering that I'd regret turning my back on family. Ethan followed, glaring at me as if I was the villain. But instead of regret, I felt free. For the first time, my home actually felt like mine. No manipulation, no emotional blackmail. Just silence and peace. I started focusing harder on work, pushing my design firm to new heights. I signed 2 major clients and moved into a better office space. Things were finally going right. Until a month later, when I received a phone call that made my blood run cold. It was from my mother's number. But the voice on the other end wasn't hers. "Hello, ma'am. This is Officer Reed from the local precinct. We're calling to inform you that your mother filed a complaint regarding financial neglect and emotional abuse." For a moment, I thought I misheard. "What? That's absurd. She claims you've withheld financial support, despite being her primary provider, leaving her without means of living." I couldn't even breathe. My mother had actually gone that far, using the system to try to punish me for saying no. The officer sounded apologetic. "We'll need you to come in and make a statement. It's probably just a misunderstanding, but it has to be documented." I hung up and sat frozen. My mind flashed through years of sacrifices. The rent I'd covered, the bills I'd paid, the times I'd gone hungry so they could eat. Now, they wanted to destroy me for walking away. That night, I cried for the first time in years. But beneath the tears was a new kind of resolve. Cold, focused, unshakable. They wanted a war. Then they'd get one. Not through yelling or revenge fueled by anger, but through something far more devastating: success. Real, undeniable, unstoppable success that would make them choke on every word they'd ever used to belittle me. And I already had the perfect plan forming in my mind. The moment I hung up the phone that night, everything shifted inside me. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the pain. They stopped feeling like wounds and started feeling like fuel. I had spent years bending over backward for people who would never do the same for me. Now, I was done being their safety net. The next morning, I got dressed not like a broken daughter, but like a woman who was about to rewrite her story. I called my lawyer, Miss Thompson, a sharp, unshakable woman who didn't flinch at anything. When I told her about the bogus complaint, she didn't sound surprised. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said firmly. "But don't worry, Natalie. We'll handle this legally and cleanly. If they want a war, we'll give them a courtroom." We gathered every receipt, every bank transfer, every message showing the years I supported my mother and Ethan. My lawyer built a file so solid it could bury their lies in minutes. But I didn't stop there. I decided to build my own kind of empire. One they couldn't touch, mock, or steal from. I threw myself into my business like never before. Days turned into nights, and nights into quiet victories. My small design firm grew fast. I landed a major contract with an international company after delivering a pitch they called breathtaking. That single deal changed everything. I upgraded my workspace, hired a full team, and tripled my income in 6 months. While they wasted their energy trying to drag me down, I was rising higher than they'd ever imagined. Then came the hearing. My mother walked in with fake tears, wearing a sad expression that might have fooled strangers but not me. Ethan sat next to her, smirking like he'd already won. But then my lawyer stood up, calm, precise, ruthless. She presented every piece of evidence: rent receipts, utility payments, tuition transfers, grocery bills, medical support. Each document landed like a hammer. My mother's claims crumbled in real time. The judge turned to her and said, "It seems your daughter has provided for you extensively. This case has no legal grounds." Her face drained of color. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Walking out of that courtroom was one of the most powerful moments of my life. For years, I had walked out of rooms feeling small, ashamed, guilty for simply existing. But that day, I walked out with my head high. I wasn't their victim anymore. But the real revenge hadn't even started yet. A few weeks later, I launched a high-profile campaign with my firm. An elegant, cinematic project that went viral online. My name was suddenly everywhere. Interview requests, invitations to galas, and business opportunities flooded in. The same family who once called me selfish now had to watch my name trending on their phones. The same people who said I'd never be enough now saw me being celebrated by thousands of strangers. I didn't block them this time. No, I wanted them to see every single win. Ethan tried texting me first. "Hey, maybe we can talk. We're still family." I didn't reply. Then my mother called. Voicemail after voicemail. "Natalie, sweetheart, we should put everything behind us. You're successful now. We're proud of you." Proud of me. They were proud of the person they'd tried to break. I saved every voicemail but never answered. Because this wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming me. And the best part, my story wasn't over. The storm I was about to bring would leave them standing in the ruins of their own selfishness. The first tremor came as a whisper. An email forwarded by an old neighbor, who'd seen the court filings, and didn't understand why someone would attack their family in public. The whisper became a murmur when a blogger I didn't know wrote an op-ed about entitled relatives who weaponize family as an ATM. Then the murmur went viral. I remember exactly where I was when my phone began to glow. The kitchenette of my apartment, a mug cooling beside the sink, sunlight making a strip of gold across the floor. At first the notifications were sympathetic. Friends, co-workers, a few nurses who'd cried when I told them what had happened. Then came the messages from strangers. Women in their 20s and 60s who sent 3-line confessions. My mother did this too. I thought I was alone. "Thank you for making this normal to say out loud." The woman who once smiled and had not prepared for attention. She had built her life on polite silences and assumed loyalty. She could not survive the world when it refused to look away. The charity board she chaired called an emergency meeting. The country club quietly removed her name from upcoming luncheons. The book club that used to fawn over her baking photos suddenly had an opening in their roster. It was petty in a delicious way. Petty and devastating. But petty wasn't where the blow landed. The real damage came from the audits. A local paper ran a piece after combing through property records and found transfers and loans that had never been repaid. A former neighbor posted a photo of a ledger her mother had kept. The handwriting matched what I'd already seen. The board at her charity requested accounting records. The accounting firm that had once praised her stewardship asked for clarification. When the call came, soft, rehearsed, insistent, "We need to discuss a discrepancy." I felt no glee. I felt relief, cold and clinical. like a wound finally being cleaned. My brother tried the theatrics at first. Vengeful social posts, photos of their humble life, thinly veiled jabs at my character. But the internet is both judge and jury, and narrative runs on receipts. Screenshots of his lavish purchases matched timestamps on transfers I'd documented. A client of his small contracting business posted a review about unpaid bills. His friends unfollowed him, then messaged me privately to say they'd long felt uncomfortable with his lifestyle. He abandoned his performative bravado the day a supplier called late, voice tight, telling him accounts were frozen. The judge's ruling that had once been a legal exhale for me had opened a cascade. Creditors came knocking. The charity announced it would repay misallocated funds. The local pastor who'd hosted her at speaking events issued a statement transparency was their priority. Community members who had once swallowed the family's story raw were now asking sharp questions. It was as if sunlight, slow, relentless, had been poured into every crevice. There was a blow I hadn't anticipated, the way this all peeled back grief. People started reaching out to me not to celebrate, but to tell me the private ways they'd been harmed. A woman in her 60s sent a message about an aunt who always borrowed and never returned. A young nurse admitted she'd signed a loan and lived in fear. Each story added a weight and a blessing. I was not alone, and my case was not an anomaly. The voices I'd worried to amplify became an unexpected chorus. We weren't shrill, we were necessary. That chorus pushed a retracting tide toward my mother. Her narrated history, victim, martyr, weathered woman, crumbled under proof of pattern. When she finally called, her voice was thin and unfamiliar. She asked, more pleading than accusing, if we could fix things quietly. I listened to her words the way you might watch a storm from a safe window, vast, dangerous, and beautiful in its honesty. I had already written the paperwork, engaged the auditors, and advised my counsel to accept restitution only if it came with corrective action. Financial transparency, repayment plans, and documentation that would prevent her repeating the cycle elsewhere. She complied. The check arrived in an envelope without flourish, exact numbers, quiet ink. I sat with it on my kitchen table and felt none of the cinematic satisfaction movies promise. There was no triumphant music, no cackling reveal. There was instead the small domestic sound of life continuing. The kettle on, the neighbor's dog barking, a delivery truck idling. But underneath, a steady, personal recalibration. The chest unknotted a degree. I deposited the funds not into my account, but into a new bank account I opened for something I'd planned long before the struggle. A fund to train young caregivers in financial literacy and boundary setting. I wanted the money to do what my family had not. It would teach, not take. Publicly, the fallout finished the portrait. The charity board announced new oversight. The community center where my mother had volunteered established mandatory financial audits. My brother lost a bid for a small state grant when questions of fiscal responsibility surfaced. They were left to rebuild in the rubble of their choices, while I rebuilt my life on foundation stones of my own making. Still, the climax of that reckoning, the explosive, satisfying apex I had imagined on sleepless nights, was quieter than I'd imagined. It arrived at a neighborhood meeting when a woman stood and said, voice steady, "I used to think you were kind. I was wrong because I was naive. Thank you for showing me what accountability looks like." The room applauded, not for me, but for the idea that a family is not a free pass to harm others. The most surprising consequence, perhaps, was forgiveness. Slow, non-performative, and entirely my choice. Years of therapy had taught me how to separate accountability from cruelty. When my father, finally honest and crumpled, put his hand on my arm and apologized for what he'd failed to see and stop, I said, "Thank you." The word held an amnesty of sorts, not for their actions, but for the part of me that needed to move past them. The viral storm faded as suddenly as it had flared. New stories took its place, new outrages and new heroes. But what remained was steady. I had my life. My work expanded into community programming. The fund I'd started began to receive small donations from people who had seen the coverage and wanted to help others avoid what I'd lived through. As the last page of that chapter closed, I realized the final act of my revenge had never been to break them completely. It had been to refuse to be broken by them. To turn their consumption of me into fuel for others. To stand in front of the life they tried to use as a credit line and say, with the careful metal I had learned from years of night shifts and spreadsheets, "This is mine." And in the quiet that followed, as I updated the ledger of a life rebuilt, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time possible. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, overlooking a city that finally felt like mine. The skyline shimmered against the soft gold of sunset, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. No guilt. No constant anxiety. No late night calls asking for just one more favor. My life had become beautifully ordinary. Morning coffee, long shifts at the clinic, weekends volunteering for the fund I'd built. People called it inspiring. But to me, it was just breathing freely again. Every donation, every letter from a young caregiver, thanking us for teaching them how to protect their finances, felt like a small victory. Not over my mother, but over the cycle she came from. Still, some nights, memories found their way back. The image of my mother standing in my doorway, pretending that manipulation was love. My brother's smug grin when he thought he had me cornered. The sound of their voices when I refused them, sharp and accusing. "You've changed." Yes, I had. The truth is, revenge stories always make you imagine a grand finale. A courtroom gasp, a public humiliation, an apology that fixes everything. But real life doesn't end in fireworks. It ends in quiet moments where you look around and realize you've reclaimed peace they never wanted you to have. One afternoon, I received an envelope. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother's. Inside was a letter, trembling with regret. She wrote that she had lost everything: her standing, her friends, even her charity board. My brother had distanced himself from her, too, blaming her for his own ruin. She said she missed me, that she didn't recognize herself anymore, that maybe she never really knew me either. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it, placed it in a drawer, and whispered, "I forgive you." Not for her, for me. Because forgiveness wasn't an invitation back into my life, it was the final act of freedom. Weeks later, my fund was featured in a local newspaper. The journalist asked what motivated me to start it. I smiled and said, "Because someone once tried to make me believe love was a transaction. I learned it's an investment in yourself." When the article went live, I received hundreds of messages again. But this time, it wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about hope. About daughters who'd finally stood up for themselves. Sons who'd said, "Nah," to guilt. Families beginning to heal after years of manipulation. I walked to the window that night, watching the city lights pulse like constellations, and felt an unexpected warmth. Not pride, exactly, but closure. My mother had taken so much from me, but unintentionally, she'd also given me something precious: purpose. The final piece of my revenge was simple. Success without their shadow. No confrontation, no public spectacle. Just me, living fully, authentically, without apology. And maybe that's the sweetest justice there is. Not proving them wrong, but proving to yourself that you were always enough. The phone buzzed once on the counter. A message from my lawyer. The final settlement had cleared. The debts repaid. The chapter closed. I made tea, turned on the record player, and let the music fill the room. Outside, the city hummed with life, 1,000 stories unfolding, but mine had already found its ending. Not in vengeance, not in victory, but in peace.